Chapter 9 The Shepherd's Story. Your Majesty, said Herringbone, hurrying toward King Fred, who just risen from the throne, there is a shepherd from the marshlands, here to petition you, sire. He's a little late. I could send him away, if your Majesty wants his lunch. A marshlander, said Spittleworth, waving his scented handkerchief beneath his nose. Imagine, sire. Dashed impertinence being late for the king, said Flapoon. No, said Fred, after a brief hesitation. No. If the poor fellow has traveled this far, we shall see him. Send him in, Herringbone. The chief adviser was delighted at this further evidence of a new, kind, and considerate king, and hurried off to the double doors to tell the guards to let the shepherd inside. The king settled himself back on his throne, and Spittleworth and Flapoon sat back down on their chairs, their expressions sour. The old man, who now tottered up the long red carpet toward the throne, was very weather-beaten and rather dirty, with a straggly beard and ragged, patched clothes. He snatched off his cap as he approached the king, looking thoroughly frightened, and when he reached the place where people usually bowed or curtsied, he fell to his knees instead. Your Majesty, he wheezed. Your Majesty, Spittleworth imitated him softly, making the old shepherd sound like a sheep. Flapoon's chins trembled with silent laughter. Your Majesty, continued the shepherd, I have traveled for 5 long days to see ye. It has been a hard journey. I has ridden in hayricks when I could and walked when I couldn't, and my boots is all holes. Oh, get on with it, do, muttered Spittleworth, his long nose still buried in his handkerchief. But all the time I was traveling, I thought of old Patch, sire, and how ye'd help me, if I could but reach the palace. What is old Patch, good fellow? Said the king, his eyes upon the shepherd's much-darned trousers. 'Tis my old dog, sire, or was, I should perhaps say, replied the shepherd, his eyes filling with tears. Ah, said King Fred, rumbling with the money purse at his belt, then, good shepherd, take these few gold coins and buy yourself a new. Nay, sir, thank ye, but it bain't a question of the gold, said the shepherd. I can find myself a puppy easy enough, though it'll never match old Patch. The shepherd wiped his nose on his sleeve. Spittleworth shuddered. Well, then, why have you come to me? Asked King Fred as kindly as he knew how. To tell ye, sire, how Patch met his end. Ah, said King Fred, his eyes wandering to the golden clock on the mantelpiece. Well, we'd love to hear the story, but we are rather wanting our lunch. 'Twas the Ickabog that ate him, sire, said the shepherd. There was an astonished silence, and then Spittleworth and Flapoon burst out laughing. The shepherd's eyes overflowed with tears, which fell sparkling onto the red carpet. They've laughed at me from Jeroboam to Chauville, sire, when I've told them why I was coming to see ye. Laughed themselves silly, they have, and told me I was daft in the head. But I seen the monster with me own 2 eyes, and so did poor Patch, afore he was 8. King Fred felt a strong urge to laugh along with the 2 lords. He wanted his lunch, and he wanted to get rid of the old shepherd, but at the same time, that horrid little voice was whispering, selfish, vain, and cruel, inside his head. Why don't you tell me what happened? King Fred said to the shepherd, and Spittleworth and Flapoon stopped laughing at once. Well, sire, said the shepherd, wiping his nose in his sleeve, 'twas twilight and right foggy, and Patch and me was walking home round the edge of the marsh. Patch sees a marsh teasel. See a what? Asked King Fred. A marsh teasel, sire. Them's bald, rat-like things what lives in the marsh. Not bad in pies, if ye don't mind the tails. Flapoon looked queasy. So Patch sees the marsh teasel, the shepherd continued, and he gives chase. I shouts for Patch and shouts, Sire, but he was too busy to come back. And then, sire, I hear a yelp. Patch! I cries, Patch, what's got ye, lad? But Patch don't come back, sire. And then I sees it, through the fog, said the shepherd in a low voice. Huge it is, with eyes like lanterns and a mouth as wide as that there throne, and its wicked teeth shining at me. And I forget old Patch, sire, and I runs and runs and runs all the way home. And next day I sets off, sire, to come and see ye. The Ickabog ate me dog, sire, and I want it punished. The king looked down at the shepherd for a few seconds, and very slowly he got to his feet. Shepherd, said the king, we shall travel north this very day to investigate the matter of the Ickabog once and for all. If any trace of the creature can be found, you may rest assured that it shall be tracked to its lair and punished for its impudence in taking your dog. Now, take these few gold coins and hire yourself a ride back home in a hay cart. My lords, said the king, turning to the stunned Spittleworth and Flapoon, pray change into your riding gear and follow me to the stables. There is a new hunt afoot. Chapter 10, King Fred's Quest. King Fred strode from the throne room feeling quite delighted with himself. Nobody would ever again say that he was selfish, vain, and cruel. For the sake of a smelly, simple old shepherd and his worthless old mongrel, he, King Fred the Fearless, was going to hunt the Ickabog. True, there was no such thing, but it was still dashed fine and noble of him to ride to the other end of the country in person to prove it. Quite forgetting lunch, the king rushed upstairs to his bedroom, shouting for his valet to come and help him out of the dreary black suit and into his battle dress, which he'd never had the chance to wear before. The tunic was scarlet with buttons of gold, a purple sash, and lots of medals Fred was allowed to wear because he was king. And when Fred looked in the mirror and saw how well battle dress became him, he wondered why he didn't wear it all the time. As his valet lowered the king's plumed helmet onto his golden curls, Fred imagined himself painted, wearing it, seated on his favorite milk-white charger and spearing a serpent-like monster with his lance. King Fred, the fearless indeed. Why, he half hoped there really was an Ickabog now. Meanwhile, the chief advisor was sending word throughout the city within the city that the king was setting off on a tour of the country, and that everyone should be ready to cheer him as he left. Herringbone made no mention of the Ickabog because he wanted to prevent the king from looking foolish, if he could. Unfortunately, the footman called Cankerby had overheard two advisors muttering together about the king's strange scheme. Cankerby immediately told the between maid, who spread the word all over the kitchens, where a sausage seller from Baronstown was gossiping with the cook. In short, by the time the king's party was ready to leave, word had spread all throughout the city within the city that the king was riding north to hunt the Ickabog, and news was also beginning to leak out into wider Showville. Is it a joke? The capital's inhabitants asked one another as they thronged out onto the pavements, ready to cheer the king. What does it mean? Some shrugged and laughed and said the king was merely having fun. Others shook their head and muttered that there must be more to it than that. No king would ride out armed to the north of the country without good reason. What the worried folk asked one another, does the king know that we do not? Lady Yslanda joined the other ladies of the court on a balcony to watch the soldiers assembling. I shall now tell you a secret which nobody else knew. Lady Yslanda would never have married the king, even if he'd asked her. You see, she was secretly in love with a man called Captain Goodfellow, who was now chatting and laughing with his good friend, Major Beamish, in the courtyard below. Lady Yslanda, who was very shy, had never been able to bring herself to talk to Captain Goodfellow, who had no idea that the most beautiful woman at court was in love with him. Both Goodfellow's parents, who were dead, had been cheesemakers from Kurdsburg. Though Goodfellow was clever and brave, these were the days when no cheesemaker's son would expect to marry a high-born lady. Meanwhile, all the servants' children were being led out of school early to watch the battle party set off. Mrs. Beamish, the pastry chef, naturally rushed to collect Bert so that he'd have a good spot to watch his father passing by. When the palace gates opened at last and the cavalcade rode out, Bert and Mrs. Beamish cheered at the top of their lungs. Nobody had seen battle dress for a very long time. How exciting it was, and how fine! The sunlight played upon the golden buttons, silver swords, and the gleaming trumpets of the buglers, and up on the palace balcony the handkerchiefs of the ladies of the court fluttered in farewells like doves. At the front of the procession rode King Fred on his milk-white charger, holding scarlet reins and waving at the crowds. Right behind him, riding a thin yellow horse and wearing a bored expression, was Spittleworth, and next came Flapoon, furiously lunchless and sitting on his elephantine chestnut. Behind the king and the two lords trotted the royal guard, all of them on dapple gray horses, except for Major Beamish, who rode his steel-gray stallion. It made Mrs. Beamish's heart flutter to see her husband looking so handsome. "Good luck, Daddy," shouted Bert, and Major Beamish, though he really shouldn't have done, waved at his son. The procession trotted down the hill, smiling at the cheering crowds of the city within the city until it reached the gates in the wall out onto wider Showville. There, hidden by the crowds, was the Dovetail's cottage. Mr. Dovetail and Daisy had come out into their garden, and they were just able to see the plumes in the helmets of the royal guard riding past. Daisy didn't feel much interest in the soldiers. She and Bert still were not talking to each other. In fact, he'd spent morning break with Roderick Roach, who often jeered at Daisy for wearing coveralls instead of a dress, so the cheering and the sound of the horses didn't raise her spirits at all. "There isn't really an Ickabog, Daddy, is there?" she asked. "No, Daisy," sighed Mr. Dovetail, turning back to his workshop. "There's no Ickabog, but if the king wants to believe in it, let him. He can't do much harm up in the marshlands." Which just goes to show that even sensible men may fail to see a terrible, looming danger. Chapter 11, The Journey North. King Fred's spirit rose higher and higher as he rode out of Showville and into the countryside. Word of the king's sudden expedition to find the Ickabog had now spread to the farmers who worked the rolling green fields, and they ran with their families to cheer the king, the two lords, and the royal guard as they passed. Not having had any lunch, the king decided to stop in Kurdsburg to eat a late dinner. "Well, rough it here, chaps, like the soldiers we are," he cried to his party as they entered the city, famed for its cheese, "and we'll set out again at first light." But of course, there was no question of the king roughing it. Visitors at Kurdsburg's finest inn were thrown out onto the street to make way for him. So Fred slept that night in a brass bed with a duck-down mattress after a hearty meal of toasted cheese and chocolate fondue. The lords Spittleworth and Flapoon, on the other hand, were forced to spend the night in a little room over the stables, but were rather sore after a long day on horseback. You may wonder why that was, if they went hunting 5 times a week, but the truth was that they generally sneaked off to sit behind a tree after half an hour's hunting, where they ate sandwiches and drank wine until it was time to go back to the palace. Neither was used to spending hours in the saddle, and Spittleworth's bony bottom was already starting to blister. Early the following morning, the king was brought word by Major Beamish that the citizens of Baronstown were very upset the king had chosen to sleep in Kurdsburg rather than their splendid city. Eager not to dent his popularity, King Fred instructed his party to ride in an enormous circle through the surrounding fields. being cheered by farmers all the way, so that they ended up in Baronstown by nightfall. The delicious smell of sizzling sausages greeted the royal party, and a delighted crowd carrying torches escorted Fred to the best room in the city. There he was served roasted ox and honey ham and slept in a carved oak bed with a goose down mattress, while Spittleworth and Flapoon had to share a tiny attic room, usually occupied by two maids. By now, Spittleworth's bottom was extremely painful, and he was furious that he'd been forced to ride 40 miles in a circle purely to keep the sausage makers happy. Flapoon, who'd eaten far too much cheese in Kurtzburg and had consumed 3 beefsteaks in Baronstown, was awake all night, groaning with indigestion. Next day, the king and his men set off again, and this time they headed north, soon passing through vineyards from which eager grape pickers emerged to wave cornucopian flags and receive waves from the jubilant king. Spittleworth was almost crying from pain in spite of the cushion he had strapped to his bottom, and Flapoon's belches and moans could be heard even over the clatter of hooves and jingles of bridles. Upon arrival at Jeroboam that evening, they were greeted by trumpets in the entire city singing the national anthem. Fred feasted on sparkling wine and truffles that night before retiring to a silken 4-poster bed with a swan's down mattress. But Spittleworth and Flapoon were forced to share a room over the inn's kitchen with a pair of soldiers. Drunken Jeroboam dwellers were reeling about in the street, celebrating the presence of the king in their city. Spittleworth spent much of the night sitting in a bucket of ice, and Flapoon, who drank far too much red wine, spent the same period being sick in a second bucket in a corner. At dawn next morning, the king and his party set out for the marshlands, after a famous farewell from the citizens of Jeroboam, who saw him on his way with a thunderous popping of corks that made Spittleworth's horse rear and ditch him on the road. Once they dusted Spittleworth off and put the cushion back on his bottom, and Fred had stopped laughing, the party proceeded. Soon they had left Jeroboam behind and could hear only birdsong. For the first time in their entire journey, the sides of the road were empty. Gradually, the lush green land gave way to thin, dry grass, crooked trees, and boulders. "Extraordinary place, isn't it?" the cheerful king shouted back to Spittleworth and Flapoon. "I'm jolly glad to see these marshlands at last, aren't you?" The two lords agreed, but once Fred had turned to face the front again, they made rude gestures and mouthed even ruder names at the back of his head. At last the royal party came across a few people, and how the marshlanders stared. They fell to their knees like the shepherd in the throne room, and quite forgot to cheer or clap, but gaped as though they'd never seen anything like the king and the royal guard before, which indeed they had not, because while King Fred had visited all the major cities of Cornucopia after his coronation, nobody had thought it was worth his while to visit the faraway marshlands. "Simple people, yes, but rather touching, aren't they?" the king called gaily to his men, as some ragged children gasped at the magnificent horses. They had never seen animals so glossy and well-fed in their lives. "And where are we supposed to stay tonight?" Flapoon muttered to Spittleworth, eyeing the tumble-down stone cottages. "No taverns here." "Well, there's one comfort, at least," Spittleworth whispered back. "He'll have to rough it like the rest of us, and we'll see how much he likes it." They rode on through the afternoon, and at last, as the sun began to sink, they caught sight of the marsh where the Ickabog was supposed to live. A wide stretch of darkness, studded with strange rock formations. "Your Majesty," called Major Beamish, "I suggest we set up camp now and explore the marsh in the morning. As your Majesty knows, the marsh can be treacherous. Fogs come suddenly here. We do best to approach it by daylight." "Nonsense," said Fred, who was bouncing up and down in his saddle like an excited schoolboy. "We can't stop now when it's in sight, Beamish." The king had given his order, so the party rode on until at last, when the moon had risen and was sliding in and out behind inky clouds, they reached the edge of the marsh. It was the eeriest place any of them had ever seen, wild and empty and desolate. A chilly breeze made the rushes whisper, but otherwise it was dead and silent. "As you see, sire," said Lord Spittleworth after a while, "the ground is very boggy. Sheep and men alike would be sucked under if they walked out too far. Then the feeble-minded might take those giant rocks and boulders for monsters in the dark. The rustling of these weeds might even be taken for the hissing of some creature." "Yes, true, very true," said King Fred, but his eyes still roamed over the dark marsh, as though he expected the Ickabog to pop up from behind a rock. "Shall we pitch a camp then, sire?" asked Lord Flapoon, who'd saved some cold pies from Baronstown and was eager for his supper. "We can't expect to find even an imaginary monster in the dark," pointed out Spittleworth. "True, true," repeated King Fred regretfully. "Let us—" Good gracious, how foggy it has become. And sure enough, as they stood looking out across the marsh, a thick, white fog had rolled over them so swiftly and silently that none of them had noticed it. And we shall stop there.